This is LBC with Andrew Pearce. Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850.
Andrew Pearce here in for Nick Ferrari. So the last British flight has landed. I'm joined now by James Cleverly, who's the Foreign Office Minister. He's the Minister for Middle East and North Africa and the Tory MP for Braintree. Mr Cleverly, good morning to you. The British government says around 800 to 1,100 Afghans eligible to return have been left behind. The Labour Party think the figure could be closer to 5,000. How did we get it quite so badly wrong?
Well, I think it's impossible for anyone to put an absolute figure on that number. And you've got to remember that over the last few weeks, we have evacuated or repatriated over 15,000 people. We repatriated and evacuated a number of thousand people prior to the Taliban getting to Kabul. And we have extended in a very, I think, very honourable and generous way the hand of refuge to those Afghans who, whether they be pursuing women's rights or girls' education, or whether they were a religious minority or gay, for example, and are now at risk of reprisals from the Taliban. So we have done a Herculean task in the most incredibly difficult, challenging and unpredictable circumstances.
But there were assurances which have not been met, and some of those assurances were to the Afghan interpreters who bravely served alongside the British military. Hundreds of those are still in Afghanistan. We know some have already been murdered by the Taliban. You can't call that a success. That is a failure, Mr Cleverly.
Well, obviously, we would love to be in a position where we could have protected everybody that worked with us and worked for us. But the Arab scheme, which we initiated in April of this year, that went live in the 1st of April, and many thousands of Afghans that had worked with us and their families were repatriated before the fall of Kabul, and a number more were repatriated or evacuated from Kabul airport. And of course, it is heartbreaking to know that not all of them were able to get out, and some of them have been killed and may well, indeed are, frankly, still at risk from the Taliban. But we have not stopped our evacuation effort. And even though we don't have access to Kabul airport anymore, we're still negotiating with other countries to look at other routes whereby those who are not able to get to Kabul can perhaps get out of the country through other means.
Pleased about that, but we couldn't get Afghan interpreters out whose lives are now at risk. How is that? Isn't that the wrong priority here?
Well, I can absolutely assure you that our priority was getting people out. We weren't able, and we were never. We were. It was always going to be an incredibly difficult task getting absolutely everybody out that needed to get out. When Afghanistan fell so very, very quickly, when the Taliban got to Kabul quicker than I suspect even they anticipated, it made the job of evacuations and repatriations unbelievably difficult. But throughout this, we have prioritised the people that work with us. Obviously, British nationals, they have to be our first priority, but also those that worked with us and those who are or were at risk of reprisals. And we have always prioritised evacuation people over evacuating animals. Well, Mr. Farthing is a British national. He had the opportunity to leave Afghanistan much earlier. His staff were enrolled onto the scheme by which Afghans that had worked with the British were able to be evacuated. But as I've said, we have always prioritised the evacuation over people. We set up a specific scheme which we put live in April of this year for those Afghans that had worked directly with us, and many thousands were evacuated before Kabul fell and since Kabul fell, and we will keep working to get our Afghan friends out of Afghanistan through whatever other methods we are able to. Look, I'm a Foreign Office minister. I am not an expert on animal infection control. I think it would be inconceivable that they weren't tested for diseases. I don't know the process by which we're going to focus on making sure that we extend that warm hand of friendship to our Afghan friends who have come here, and we are making sure that money is available for local government to do just that. But how we deal, that's a DEFRA responsibility. How we deal with those animals, I think I have to rely on the expertise of other departments. Well, we are very, very cautious about taking as read the assurances made by the Taliban. They clearly aspire to being treated like a real government. And what the Prime Minister has said, and I think this is absolutely right, is that we will judge them on their actions rather than their words. And if they want to be treated like a legitimate government, they have to act as a government would. And that means facilitating the exit of people who now have a right to leave Afghanistan. If they do that, if they are as good as their word, we will engage with them on that basis. But as I say, we are sceptical. And that's why we're working with international partners, both the near neighbours of Afghanistan and more widely, to look at ways that we can continue that repatriation and evacuation effort. Well, you've got to remember, embassies belong to countries, not governments. And we, as I say, we will treat the Taliban, the way we interact with the Taliban will be entirely dependent on how they act. They clearly aspire to be treated like a government. We are not anywhere near that place yet. If they behave in the way that they have committed to, then there is a sequencing of engagement. But we are nowhere near the whole, treating the Taliban as if they were a legitimate government of Afghanistan. Not yet. Well, the friends of mine, I didn't serve in Afghanistan. The friends of mine who did often heap praise on the Afghan special forces. They have demonstrated themselves to be incredibly tough and reliable partners to the British Armed Forces and indeed other armed forces that they served with. Ultimately, that will be a decision made elsewhere, but I know that there is a huge amount of personal and professional respect for the Afghan armed forces, particularly the Afghan special forces, who put themselves in incredibly dangerous situations in support of UK armed forces and others. Well, the airlift was an amazing evacuation operation. As I say, we got over 15,000 people. Government departments and ministers, including Dominic, worked incredibly hard. We worked together. We were able to get out over 15,000 people in those last couple of weeks because all bits of government had a role to play and discharged those roles and those functions incredibly professionally. And that includes Dominic as well. We none of us could have done it on our own. We could only do it working collaboratively. That's what happened. It was a brutal, horrible, incredibly difficult time. And yet, as I say, we were able to evacuate over 15,000 people. And I think that is a Herculean task. There is still much work to do, and we will continue to work collaboratively across Whitehall, across department, to make sure we get out as many of those Afghans as possible.
To Foreign Office Minister James Cleverly, thanks for joining us. Now, coming up in the programme, we're going to be talking about those GP appointments. You're going to struggle, I'm afraid, to see a GP face-to-face. According to new figures, in parts of the country, only half of you will see a GP in their surgery. Also, we're going to be talking about Pen Farthing. Impossible to avoid, it's everywhere. He's back with his menagerie of animals, but was he given priority over men and women and children, including